In the autumn of 217 BC, a Roman general did something that, by every standard of his culture, should have ended his career in disgrace. Hannibal Barca had just annihilated 2 Roman armies in the space of a year. First at the Trebia, then in a fog-shrouded ambush at Lake Trasimene, where 15,000 Roman soldiers died in a single morning. Rome's answer was to appoint a dictator, hand him the largest army the Republic could raise, and demand vengeance. Instead, the man they chose did something almost unthinkable. He refused to fight. He shadowed Hannibal's army for months. He burned the crops in Hannibal's path, cut off his supply lines, harassed his stragglers, and never once offered the decisive battle everyone in Rome was screaming for. His own soldiers called him a coward. The Senate nearly stripped him of command. Men who had lost fathers and brothers at Trasimene watched this general march past Hannibal's army, again and again, without drawing a sword, and they assumed they were watching Rome's final humiliation unfold in slow motion. And yet, within 15 years, Rome would defeat Hannibal completely on Hannibal's own soil, ending Carthage as a power forever. The man who refused to fight is the reason Rome ultimately won, not despite his humiliation, because of it. And by the end of this video, you will understand the strategic principle he embodied, one used deliberately by Sun Tzu, by Machiavelli, and by every person who has ever quietly outmaneuvered someone stronger than them by first letting that person believe they already won. This is not a video about giving up. It is a video about a much rarer and more dangerous skill, knowing precisely which battles are worth losing on purpose, so that the war itself becomes unlosable. Most people spend their lives, every inch of ground, every argument, every perceived slight, because retreat feels identical to defeat. It isn't, and the moment you learn to tell the two apart, something changes in how power moves around you, including, as you'll see near the end, a specific tactical error the Romans almost repeated a second time, one that would have undone everything Fabius built. By the time we reach the close of this video, you'll have a working framework for making that distinction under real pressure, not just an appreciation for how one Roman general happened to make it 2,000 years ago. To understand weaponized humility, you have to understand the man who first practiced it at civilizational scale. Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. By 217 BC, Rome was a wounded animal. Hannibal had crossed the Alps with war elephants and a force built from dates of Carthaginian military innovation, and he had proven that he could annihilate a Roman army in open battle whenever he chose the ground. Rome's entire military culture was built around the pitched battle. Meet the enemy in the field, mass your legions, and win through discipline and weight of numbers. It had worked for centuries. Against Hannibal, it was a death sentence. Fabius was appointed dictator, a temporary but near absolute Roman office reserved for existential emergencies. He looked at the situation with a clarity almost nobody else in Rome could afford, because almost nobody else was willing to admit what the loss at Trasimene actually meant. Hannibal was better than Rome at the game Rome wanted to play. So Fabius changed the game. He adopted what history now calls the Fabian strategy. Avoid decisive battle entirely, harass the enemy's supply lines, deny him easy plunder, let time and terrain and Hannibal's own isolation from reinforcements do the damage that Roman swords could not yet do. It worked tactically. It also cost him almost everything politically. The Roman public, and even his own second-in-command, Marcus Minucius Rufus, patience as cowardice. Fabius earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, meant as an insult. He was so unpopular that the Senate eventually split his command in half, giving Minucius equal authority. Largely so Minucius could go fight the battle Fabius refused to give. Minucius took the bait almost immediately, engaging Hannibal's forces in a battle that began well and then collapsed as Hannibal's cavalry moved to encircle the exposed Roman position. According to the surviving accounts, it was Fabius, watching from a nearby position with the half of the army still under his own command, who marched his troops in to break the encirclement and save Minucius's forces from what would likely have been a third catastrophic Roman defeat. Minucius is said to have publicly acknowledged Fabius's judgment, afterward and voluntarily returned command of his half of the army to him, a reconciliation Roman writers later held up as a rare example of a subordinate admitting error without lasting resentment. Sun Tzu, writing in China roughly 3 centuries earlier in The Art of War, had already articulated the principle Fabius was living out on the Italian peninsula, without ever having read a word of it. That the general who understands is not dangerous as the one who knows how to win when he does. Sun Tzu's core argument was that war is won largely before the battle begins, through position, timing, and the discipline to deny the enemy the engagement he wants, even when your own side is demanding blood. To Sun Tzu, an army that always fights when challenged is not brave. It is predictable, and predictability is a gift you hand to your enemy for free. Sun Tzu goes further than simply advising caution. He frames the decision of when to engage as a matter of accurately reading conditions, the moral alignment of your own side, the terrain, the quality of leadership, and discipline within the ranks. A commander who understood these conditions could tell in advance whether an engagement favored him, and the correct response to an unfavorable reading was refusal, regardless of what onlookers assumed about the reason. Fabius, without the benefit of Sun Tzu's text, independent applying exactly this kind of terrain and timing analysis. Italy's countryside, Hannibal's supply lines, and Rome's home field advantage all favored, and Fabius read those conditions correctly even while his own soldiers read only his refusal to fight. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in Renaissance Florence roughly 1,700 years after Fabius, studied this exact episode directly. Fabius appears by name in Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, where Machiavelli treats him as a case study in the political cost of correct strategy. Machiavelli's broader argument, echoed later throughout The Prince, was that the appearance of weakness is sometimes the most powerful position available to a ruler, provided the ruler has the private discipline to endure the public humiliation that appearance produces. This is the seed of what Robert Greene would later formalize in far more explicit and modern language in the 48 Laws of Power, the idea that appearing lesser than you are can be a deliberate strategic tool, not merely a description of misfortune. Machiavelli's most famous articulation of this idea, elsewhere in The Prince, is his image of the ruler who must combine the instincts of the lion and the fox, the lion's strength to intimidate wolves, and the fox's cunning to recognize traps that strength alone cannot see. A ruler who relies only on the lion's approach, meeting every challenge head-on with visible force, will eventually be undone by a trap he never saw coming, because he never developed the fox's habit of reading the terrain before committing to a fight. Fabius, in Machiavelli's reading, was operating almost entirely as the fox during his dictatorship, not because he lacked the lion's strength, Rome's legions is formidable, but because the moment called for recognition of a trap, not demonstration of force. What unites all three thinkers, separated by continents and centuries, is a single uncomfortable insight. The people who in the long war are frequently willing to look like losers in the short one, and the people who cannot tolerate that appearance are the ones history quietly discards. It's worth sitting with how genuinely dangerous this position was for Fabius personally, because the modern retelling tends to flatten it into a tidy strategic lesson. Rome in 217 BC was not a culture that rewarded patience. Roman political life ran on visible achievement. Triumphs, conquered territory, dead enemies paraded through the streets. A dictator who spent a full campaigning season doing nothing that resembled a Roman victory was not just unpopular. He was, in the eyes of many senators, actively failing the office he'd been given. The fact that he held his strategy anyway, against nearly universal pressure from his own government, is the part that's Fabius from someone who simply got lucky avoiding a bad fight. He understood the criticism was the price of the strategy, not a sign that the strategy was wrong. Let's break this down into something you can actually use, because Fabius's strategy was not simply wait around. It had structure, it had discipline, and underneath the Roman politics, there are 6 distinct mechanisms at work, 6 principles that separate strategic surrender from ordinary weakness. None of these principles ask you to become passive. Passivity has no plan behind it and no exit condition. It's simply the absence of action. Everything that follows is the opposite of that. A deliberate, almost surgical decision about exactly where to spend your strength and exactly where to withhold it, made in advance rather than under duress. Principle 1. The battle you lose on purpose must be cheap. The first thing to understand about Fabius is that he wasn't avoiding all conflict. He was avoiding the specific, expensive conflict he wanted. He still harassed foraging parties. He still cut off stragglers. He conceded the large, symbolic confrontation while quietly winning dozens of small, invisible ones. This is the essential mechanism of weaponized humility. You do not surrender the war. You surrender only the engagement that costs you the most and gains your opponent the most psychological satisfaction. The psychological mechanism is about what economists call cost and what psychologists call loss aversion. Human beings, and Hannibal was no exception, are wired to interpret a conceded battle as evidence of an opponent's weakness, and that interpretation makes them careless. Hannibal spent years in Italy increasingly convinced that Rome could not or would not confront him directly, and that conviction shaped every subsequent decision he made, including where he chose to winter his troops, and how thin he allowed his supply lines to stretch. In your own life, this shows up constantly in negotiation and conflict. Think about the last time you won an argument in a meeting, decisively, in front of everyone, and think about what it cost you afterward, in resentment, in a colleague quietly working against you for months. The visible win was expensive, a cheaper concession, letting them have the small, symbolic point while you kept the actual decision would have cost you nothing real and denied them the resentment fuel that visible defeat generates. Fabius understood that the most expensive battles are rarely the ones with the highest immediate stakes. They're the ones your opponent most needs to win in order to feel secure. There's a useful distinction to draw here between a cheap loss and an expensive one. The two can look identical from the outside and only differ in what they cost you structurally. A cheap loss is one where the only thing damaged is your image in that specific room, for that specific moment, to people whose opinion won't materially affect your future. An expensive loss is one that changes the actual terms of the relationship going forward. It sets a precedent, moves a boundary, or hands the other party leverage they didn't have before. Fabius could afford to look weak to the Roman public because public opinion, however loud, did not control troop movements or supply lines. What he could not afford was losing an actual army, because that loss would have been structural and irreversible. Learning to sort your own conflicts into these two categories, quickly and honestly, is most of the skill. Consider two employees who both get overruled by their boss in a meeting in front of the same room of people. The first treats it as an expensive loss, pushes back hard, and insists on re-litigating the decision on the spot. The second reads the situation correctly, recognizes the specific point being contested is minor and reversible, and lets it go visibly and gracefully, saving the real disagreement for a private conversation later, where the stakes and the audience are different. 6 months later, one of these employees is remembered as combative and exhausting to manage. The other is remembered as someone whose private counsel is worth seeking out, precisely because they don't spend that credibility performing correctness in front of an audience. Neither was right or wrong about the substance of the disagreement. They differed only in which battlefield they chose to fight on, and that choice, repeated consistently over months and years, is what actually builds or destroys a reputation. Principle 2. Withdrawal must be a decision, never a reaction. This is the line that separates Fabius from every soldier who simply ran from Hannibal in panic. Fabius's retreat was calculated for contact, not forced during it. He chose the terrain. He chose the timing. He never let Hannibal dictate the shape of the engagement, even when the engagement was no engagement at all. This distinction matters because the psychological signal you send is completely different depending on which side of it you're on. A reactive retreat announces panic. It tells your opponent exactly where your limits are, because they just watched you hit one. A decided retreat announces control, because your opponent tell whether you're avoiding the fight, because you're weak, or because you're saving something for later. And that uncertainty is worth more to you than any single battle. Sun Tzu is explicit about this exact mechanism. The appearance of capability you choose is more valuable, tactically, than capability you're forced to reveal. An opponent who has seen you break under pressure has a map of your weaknesses. An opponent who has only seen you decline a fight has nothing but a question mark. And question marks make aggressive people cautious. This is exactly where it breaks down for most people, because most retreats in daily life, backing off in an argument, letting a project go, walking away from a confrontation, happen at the moment of maximum emotional flooding, not before it. The retreat gets read as collapse because it was collapse. Weaponized humility requires to make the call to yield before you are cornered into it, which means you need to recognize the shape of a losing engagement early, while you still have composure to frame the exit as a choice. There's a practical marker for this worth naming directly. The difference between deciding and reacting usually shows up in your body before it shows up in your words. A decided withdrawal comes with a level voice, a steady pace, and language that sounds like allocation. I'm not going to spend energy on this right now, rather than justification. A reactive one comes with a rising voice, a need to explain yourself at length, and language that sounds defensive even when the content is identical. Fabius never explained himself to Hannibal. He didn't owe Hannibal an explanation, and the silence itself was part of the strategy. It gave Hannibal nothing to analyze except the fact of the refusal, with none of the reasoning behind it. The less justification you offer for a strategic withdrawal, the more it reads as control rather than surrender. This applies with particular force in personal relationships, where the temptation to over-explain a decision to disengage is strongest. Imagine a disagreement with a partner that has started circling the same unresolved grievance for the third night in a row. Both of you increasingly tired and increasingly unfair to each other. There is a version of ending that conversation that sounds like collapse, delivered with enough contempt that it guarantees the same fight tomorrow. And there is a version that sounds like a decision. I don't think either of us is thinking clearly right now, and I'd rather talk about this tomorrow, or which ends the same conversation but changes what it means. The first hands your partner a victory built on your exhaustion. The second withholds the engagement entirely, on your terms, and it is far harder to resent a door that was closed calmly than one that was slammed. Principle 3. Let the other side overextend their victory. Hannibal's fatal error was never a single battle. It was what he did with his uncontested victories. He kept pushing deeper into Italian territory, further from Carthaginian resupply, increasingly dependent on the very Italian allies Rome was working to peel away from him. All because nobody was stopping him, and stopping felt unnecessary. Every time Fabius declined to fight, Hannibal advanced a little further into a trap that had no walls and no obvious edges, the trap of overextension. This is a pattern that shows up with remarkable consistency when one party allowed to win repeatedly without resistance. They escalate their commitments, their assumptions, and their exposure, because nothing is pushing back to signal the limit. Robert Greene, about a closely related dynamic in his discussion of allowing others to feel they have the upper hand. The target of the strategy becomes increasingly careless precisely because carelessness has, so far, been free. Think about the last time you watched someone in a position of power take advantage of an employee, a partner, or a colleague who never pushed back, not because that person had suddenly become cruel, but because the absence of resistance quietly convinced them there was no cost to taking more. Weaponized humility uses this same mechanic deliberately. By declining early confrontations, you are not just avoiding damage, you're allowing your opponent to become the very evidence that eventually turns others against them. The way Hannibal's deepening isolation in Italy led several of his Italian allies toward Rome as the war dragged on. This is a slower, more patient application of the same principle than most people are comfortable with, because it requires tolerating someone else's apparent success for longer than feels safe. But notice what actually happened to Hannibal's position each time Rome declined to fight him directly. He still had to feed his army, still had to hold territory he'd nominally won, still had to manage alliances with Italian cities that were watching to see whether backing Carthage would actually pay off. Every uncontested advance increased his logistical burden without increasing his actual security, because none of it forced Rome to negotiate or surrender. Overreach without resistance doesn't feel like exposure to the person doing it. It feels like winning. That's precisely why it's such a reliable trap. The person walking further out onto the ice has no reason to suspect the ice is thinning, because nothing has cracked yet. This same pattern is visible in business competition, with almost no modification needed. A competitor who aggressively undercuts your pricing, poaches a client, or expands into your territory unopposed will typically read your silence as confirmation that the territory is theirs for the taking and will keep expanding, opening new fronts, taking on new overhead, making promises to new customers, based on an assumption of continued resistance-free growth. Businesses that have watched a smaller rival collapse under the weight of its own overexpansion, having taken on obligations it could never sustain, understand this instinctively. The instinct to respond to every competitive move immediately is often the less patient strategy, not the more disciplined one, because it treats every skirmish as the war rather than letting the other side's own ambition become the mechanism that eventually does the damage for you. The discipline required here is genuinely uncomfortable, because it means watching a competitor, a rival, or an opponent appear to succeed for longer than your instincts want to tolerate, trusting that overreach has its own timeline, and that timeline is not yours to accelerate. Principle 4. Preserve the asset that actually wins the war. Fabius's entire strategy rested on one calculation. Rome's core strategic asset was not any single army. It was Rome's capacity to keep raising armies, keep feeding its population, and keep drawing on allies across the peninsula and the Mediterranean for longer than Carthage could sustain a single expeditionary force thousands of miles from home. Every battle Fabius declined was, specifically, a battle that would have spent that for no proportional gain. He was not protecting his own reputation. He was protecting the resource that mattered. This is the principle most people misunderstand about strategic patience, because they assume the asset being preserved is always their pride, their position, or their comfort. It rarely is, in the cases that actually matter. The real asset is almost always something quieter and more structural. Your reputation for reliability, a 10-year career, the trust of a specific relationship, your capital, financial or emotional. That compounds only if you don't spend it defending every skirmish along the way. Machiavelli's discussion of rulers who preserved their state by absorbing short-term insults on exactly this calculation. A prince who fights every challenge to his authority's legitimacy he cannot easily replace. A prince who selectively absorbs the cheap insults preserves that legitimacy for the one confrontation that will actually determine whether his rule survives. The skill is not tolerance for its own sake. It's identifying correctly which resource is actually load-bearing, and refusing to spend it anything that isn't the war itself. A useful way to test whether you've identified the right asset is to ask what would actually be replaceable if you lost it. Reputation among people who will forget the incident in a week is replaceable. A specific mentor's trust, built over years and impossible to rebuild if broken, is not. Your standing in a single meeting is replaceable. Your credibility with the one client who accounts for a third of your business is not. Fabius, notably, never tried to protect his own personal reputation. He let that erode almost completely for the sake of Rome's military capacity. The asset worth protecting is rarely the one that feels most urgent to defend in the moment, because urgency and importance are not the same thing, and mistaking one for the other is how people irreplaceable capital defending replaceable pride. There's a financial version of this principle that makes it easier to hold onto under pressure. Think of your credibility, your relationships, and your goodwill the way you'd think of capital in an investment account. Every unnecessary confrontation you win is a withdrawal. Every strategic concession that costs you nothing structurally is money left compounding. Fabius essentially refused every withdrawal that wasn't strictly necessary for a decade, which is precisely why Rome still had capital left to spend. Still needed an army capable of executing a bold offensive in North Africa. Most people run their reputational capital the opposite way, spending it constantly on encounters that don't require it, and then discovering at the one moment that genuinely matters, that the account is empty. The people who seem to have an almost supernatural amount of trust and standing available to them precisely when they need it most are, more often than not, simply the people who stopped making unnecessary withdrawals years earlier, long before anyone was watching closely enough to notice the discipline behind it. Principle 5. Know the exact moment strategy must end. This is the principle Fabius himself, according to the historical record, struggled with the most. And it's the principle that separates strategic patience from mere habit. The Fabian strategy was correct in 217 and 216 BC, when Rome's armies were shattered and Hannibal's forces were at their strongest relative advantage. It was no longer correct a decade later, when a young Roman commander named Scipio Africanus recognized that Rome had finally rebuilt enough strength and enough intelligence about Carthaginian vulnerabilities in Spain and North Africa to take the offensive directly. Fabius, by then an old man and one of Rome's most respected statesmen, actually opposed Scipio's invasion of North Africa, the very campaign that would end the war by forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy and defend Carthage itself, where Scipio finally defeated him at Zama in 202 BC. The uncomfortable lesson here is that the architect of a strategy is not always the person best positioned to recognize when that strategy has done its job. Patience that made you a strategic genius at one stage of a conflict can make you an obstacle at the next stage if you mistake the tactic for an identity. This is the callback worth holding on to, because it comes back at the very end of this video. Knowing when to lose on purpose is only half the skill. Knowing when to stop losing on purpose, when to finally take the field, is the other half, and it's the half that gets far less credit in the history books. This pattern isn't unique to Fabius, and recognizing it in modern contexts is where the principle earns its keep. The manager who built her early career on being conflict-averse and diplomatic can become the exact person blocking necessary confrontation once she's the one running the department. The negotiator who made his name in conceding small points to build long-term trust can miss the one moment where trust has already been established and further concession only reads as exploitable softness. The strategy that saved you is not obligated to keep saving you. It has a shelf life defined by the specific conditions that made it correct, and those conditions change even when your own habits don't. The practical difficulty here is that patience, unlike a single decision, becomes an identity if you practice it long enough. Fabius spent so many years being the man who wouldn't fight that by the time fighting was finally the correct call, he had genuinely lost the ability to see it clearly. Not out of stubbornness alone, but because an entire decade of correct decisions had reshaped how he saw every subsequent decision. This is worth taking seriously precisely because it isn't a character flaw unique to Fabius. It's what happens to almost anyone who becomes known, even to themselves, for a particular kind of restraint. The antidote isn't distrust of your own judgment in general. It's building in a habit of asking a specific voice. Someone who wasn't for the years of patience that built your instincts, whether the current situation still matches the conditions that made patience in the first place. Principle 6. Manage the dissent inside your own camp, not just the enemy outside it. There's a detail from the Fabius story that gets skipped in the short version of this history, and it's arguably the most practically useful part for anyone applying this today. Fabius's biggest threat during his campaign wasn't Hannibal. It was Marcus Minucius Rufus, his own second-in-command, whose public frustration with the delay strategy became so politically loud that the Roman Senate took the extraordinary step of splitting Fabius's authority in half, giving Minucius an equal command specifically so he could guide the battle Fabius refused to give. This is the part of weaponized humility that catches most people off guard, because they prepare to defend the strategy to their opponent and forget they also have to defend it to their own side, their team, their family, their allies, who are watching the same apparent weakness and interpreting it exactly the way the enemy is supposed to, because nobody explained to them either. Fabius, notably, didn't fully explain his reasoning to Minucius or the Senate in a way that satisfied them, and it nearly cost him his command. Minucius took the field on his own initiative, engaged Hannibal directly, and was saved from total destruction only when Fabius, the man he'd been undermining, marched in to rescue him. The lesson generalizes cleanly. A strategy of counter-restraint creates a vacuum of visible action, and if you don't fill that vacuum with at least some communication to the people whose trust you need, someone in your own camp will fill it with their own interpretation, usually the least charitable one available. This doesn't mean explaining your full strategy to everyone. Fabius was right not to broadcast his reasoning to Hannibal. But there is a difference between the enemy, who should know nothing, and your own allies, who need enough information to stay patient without needing to know everything. Identify specifically who in your own circle needs just enough context to hold the line with you, and give it to them deliberately before their doubt becomes someone else's opportunity to override your restraint the way the Senate overrode Fabius. Think about a founder running a startup through a deliberately slow period, turning down flashy but unsustainable growth opportunities in favor of a more conservative, cash-preserving path. To competitors and the press, that founder might look timid, but the greater risk usually isn't external perception. It's an ambitious internal hire, convinced the company is playing too small, who starts pushing for aggressive expansion the founder knows the business can't support yet. The modern equivalent of Minucius demanding his own command. Founders who navigate this well are the ones who avoid hiring ambitious people. They're the ones who bring their key people close enough into the actual reasoning, early enough, that ambition gets channeled into patience rather than into a rival faction pushing exactly the reckless move strategy was designed to avoid. What Fabius, Sun Tzu, and Machiavelli are all circling, from three completely different eras and contexts, is a single reframe of what winning actually means. Most people define a win as any moment where they were not humiliated, and a loss as any moment where they were. That definition feels intuitive because humiliation is a real, immediate, physically felt experience, and long-term strategic position is abstract, invisible, and slow. But power does not accumulate in moments. It accumulates in patterns, and the pattern that actually determines outcomes or years is not who looked strong in each individual encounter, who still has resources and options left when the engagement that actually matters finally arrives. Fabius looked weak in dozens of encounters and arrived at the decisive stage of the war with Rome's core strength intact. Hannibal looked dominant in dozens of encounters and arrived at Zama with an army built from conscripts and a coalition that had quietly abandoned him. It's worth being honest about the limits of this idea, because weaponized is not a universal solution, and treating it as one is how people talk themselves into cowardice and call it strategy. There are engagements where the cost of losing genuinely pounds, where conceding ground doesn't preserve your position, it erodes it permanently, and where an opponent is restrained not as mystery, but as a green light for escalation. Not every Hannibal is actually overextending. Some opponents are simply better resourced and better positioned, and will keep winning precisely because you keep declining to test them. Mistaking every retreat for genius is how people rationalize genuine avoidance. The way to tell the difference is to look honestly what happens to the underlying resource over time, not just at how the single encounter feels. If your position, relationship, or leverage is measurably the same or stronger after the concession than before it, you're likely engaged in the Fabian pattern. If it is measurably weaker, and continuing to concede only produces a further erosion, you are not being strategic. You are being avoidant, and the two require completely different responses. The skill Fabius had, and the skill this video is actually about, is not always yield. It's the far more demanding discipline of accurately telling the difference between a battle that costs you war if you lose it, and a battle that costs you nothing if you let it go, and having the self-control to act on that distinction even when your own pride, or your allies, are screaming at you to do the opposite. There's also a quieter, more personal payoff to this reframe that has nothing to do with winning at all. A great deal of ordinary suffering comes from treating every small defeat as data about your own worth. The meeting you didn't dominate, the argument you let go, the point you didn't score. If you can genuinely internalize that a conceded battle is not evidence of weakness, but potentially evidence of strategic clarity, a great deal of that suffering simply stops being necessary. You stop needing to win every visible exchange in order to feel secure, because your sense of your own position no longer depends on winning every visible exchange. That shift, more than any specific tactic in this video, is probably the most durable thing you can take from Fabius's decade of humiliation. He seems, by every account that survives, to have been remarkably steady throughout it. Not because he didn't feel the insults, but because he had already located his sense of whether things were going well somewhere other than the crowd's opinion of him that week. That last point is worth separating from the strategic advice entirely, because it's really a statement about where you choose to locate your own self-assessment. If your sense of whether your week went well is anchored to whether you were visibly right in every exchange, you will spend enormous energy defending positions that don't matter, and you will the sting of every small loss as though it were structural. If it's anchored instead to whether the things that actually matter to you, a key relationship, a long-term project, your own composure, are stronger at the end of the week than they were at the start, small visible losses stop registering as threats at all. They become simply the price of admission for playing a longer, more deliberate game than the people around you happen to be playing. Start with a single, specific test you can run this week, the next time you feel the pull to win a confrontation, an argument in a meeting, a disagreement, a challenge from a competitor or colleague. Pause long enough to ask one question before you respond. If I lose this specific point today, visibly, what do I actually lose? Not what it feels like you'll lose, what you will actually materially lose. Most people never ask this question at all, because the emotional cost of losing feels immediate, and the strategic cost of winning feels invisible. And invisible costs are easy to ignore, right up till they compound into something you can no longer pretend not to notice. In most cases, the honest answer is almost nothing tangible. You'll lose the feeling of having been right in front of an audience. That's the entire cost. Once you can see that clearly, the concession becomes cheap, exactly the way his declined battles were cheap, and you can make it deliberately, calmly and early, before you're forced into it by exhaustion or by being cornered. Run this test out loud a few times before you need it for real. Because the skill of naming the true cost quickly is not automatic under pressure. It has to be rehearsed somewhere low stakes first. The same way you'd any other skill you actually wanted to rely on in a real confrontation. Then do the second half of the exercise, because this is where most people stop short. Write down, specifically, what the actual asset is you're protecting by conceding. Is it a client relationship you need for the next 3 years? Is it your standing with a manager who will decide your next promotion? Is it simply your own composure, so you don't say something in anger that costs you more than the disagreement itself? Name the asset. If you cannot name a specific asset you're protecting, you're not practicing weaponized humility. You're just avoiding conflict, which is a different thing and carries none of the strategic benefit. Finally, set a private checkpoint for yourself. The way Fabius's strategy eventually had to give way to Scipio's offensive. Decide in advance what condition would tell you it's time to stop conceding and take the field. A specific pattern of the other party escalating, a specific point where the relationship or the resource you were protecting starts eroding faster than the small losses you were accepting. Patience without an exit condition isn't strategy. It's just paralysis wearing strategy's clothes. Put this into a habit you can actually sustain. Keep a short, private log. A note in your phone is enough, of a deliberate concession you make, and the asset you told yourself you were protecting by making it. Review it once a month. This does things at once. It forces you to be honest about whether you're actually protecting something specific, since vague entries will be obvious the moment you reread them, and it lets you see in aggregate whether the pattern is working, whether the relationships and resources you've been protecting are actually growing stronger, the way Rome's military capacity grew stronger under Fabius, or whether you've been accumulating losses with no compounding return, which is the signal it's time to stop conceding and take the field yourself. Fabius Maximus died in 203 BC. 1 year of a war he refused to end quickly finally ended completely. At Zama, under a commander whose bold strategy Fabius had personally opposed. History remembers him not as the man who was too afraid to fight Hannibal, but as the man whose refusal to fight, at the exact moment fighting would have destroyed Rome, kept the Republic along enough for someone else to finish what he started. The insult his own people gave him, cunctator, the delayer, is now the name history uses with reverence, not contempt. That's the resolution to the question this video opened with. The general who refused to fight didn't win by accident, and he didn't win despite the humiliation. The humiliation was the strategy. He absorbed a decade of being called a coward, so that Rome would still have an army left standing when the war actually turned. And when the moment came to stop losing on purpose, someone else had to see it. Because Fabius himself by then had built his identity around the very patience that once saved everyone. That final irony is worth sitting rather than smoothing over. The same discipline, then, one of the most consequential figures in Roman history, was also the thing that nearly made him an obstacle to the war's actual ending. Greatness and blind spots, it turns out, are frequently built from the exact same material. Here is the single sentence worth remembering. The people who win wars they weren't to win are rarely the ones who never lost. They're the ones who chose, with total precision, exactly which losses they could afford. If this is a way of thinking you want to actually get sharper at, not just understanding it, but training yourself to see the difference between a cheap defeat and an expensive one in real time, under pressure, that's exactly the kind of thinking this channel exists to build. one historical case at a time. Fabius spent 10 humiliating years that the people who shape history are rarely the ones who needed to look strong the most.